the Within Orb podcast. Come get Within Orb. Hello, my name is Jenn Zahrt, and welcome to Within Orb, a production of the Celestial Arts Education Library, a podcast bringing people together around the love of astrology, books. Join me as I interview people about the astrology books that changed their life and practice. You can support the podcast at withinorb.com. Welcome to another episode of Within Orb, and today we're flying down to Mexico to La Paz, Baja California Sur, and speaking with Bear, who just finished their MSW degree. Congratulations on that accomplishment.
Jen, I appreciate that so much. A master's degree is no joke. It was worth it. So I studied clinical social work at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. And it's very cool to see that you've got a bi-country, I guess. But I do think Milwaukee has the Great Lakes right there. So it's like a coast, right? But you have this nomadic life in a way where you were in Milwaukee and coming down to Mexico.
Indeed. Yep.
Yeah.
I'm from Iowa and we called it no coast, but in the Midwest, you have like the mid coast and people do surf on Lake Michigan. It's really, really breathtaking. Such a beautiful region of the country.
Yeah. And Milwaukee has a really incredible art museum. Did you go there while you were getting your master's degree?
All the time. All the time.
It's the most futuristic place I've ever seen.
Yeah. And they have a great collection. I love it. I love some of the exhibits they've had because they'll focus on gender or they'll bring in like Scandinavian art or, it's wonderful.
Wow. So what pushed you into the clinical social work field?
It's funny you should ask because of the Jupiter-Gemini cycle at this time, because the first time I started a social work program was 12 years ago. I left the program. I moved out to New York. I just took a different path. And it's always called to me because of what we do as astrologers is holding space, mirroring people's hearts. And I wanted to elevate that just because of some of the woo labeling often that we get. You introduce yourself as an astrologer at a party and they're like, oh, guess my sign. And you're like, oh, actually, would you do that to any other profession?
Right.
I take this to heart. And this is a language that we spend many, many years becoming fluent in. And I don't think that there is ever fluency within one lifetime. It's just not possible because of all the arenas of this study. So social work, I have a good friend who's also an astrologer, Jonah Emerson Bell, who is based in Santa Fe. And he is finishing up a counseling program. And it's odd that we both met at this time, like two astrologers starting counseling programs simultaneously. And I think it was a way to provide more stable income, for one thing, to reach into evidence-based practices, as well as finding the life cycles mirroring planetary cycles within the lifespan. So it's a really interesting field. Diversity and equity is super important to me, and social work is all about like that and anti-oppression work. And that was one of the books that I didn't get a chance to mention was Alice Sparkley Katz's Post-Colonial Astrology. And I just feel like I should have listed that because of the importance of that work and recognizing how patriarchal like a lot of astrology is, and that we have to look at systems differently. And I think what's deeply important to me is that return to nature and how so many of our psychopathologies are correlated with us not connecting with our true selves and with nature and with community. So I know that there's an overlap, and I'm just in the fledgling state of understanding all that.
Yeah, well, we can definitely circle back and bring Alice Sparkley Katz back into the conversation. But I want to go to the beginning of your relationship to astrology, because it's almost like it began before you began. You started very young.
I think astrology chose me because I spent most of my 20s running from it, because it's for those who are like learning the language, it's complicated. You look at a chart and you're like, what is this spirograph? I don't understand this thing. And I just was afraid of it, right? It was a lot. And there's a lot of information there in healing. So I was blessed with this purple-clad, white-haired Aquarian babysitter named Dorothy Cunningham in Des Moines, Iowa. And this was in, the late 80s and early 90s. And we all know that the New Age movement has been around for a long time, kind of that like pseudo-spiritualism sort of grasping from all these different cultures. But she was a babysitter to me. And I remember as early as age 4, her saying, you're an Aries, you're a little spiritual warrior. And I was like, I don't even know what that means, but I love how this woman makes me feel.
Oh.
You know, when I hit puberty is when I started seeing her as a counselor. I was not able to find therapists that I connected with, but I would sit in her tiny apartment and with her cats and with coffee, and she would just hold space for me. And I try to bring her into every reading that I offer because the way she looked at me and the way that her eyes would light up, and I felt so loved and embraced because there was never any judgment. Total Aquarius, right? Like you can just be the weird mess that you are.
Which is perfect for a preteen, honestly.
Absolutely. And I love helping teens now. And of course, with consent of parents, often they're in the next room or hanging out nearby, right? But I felt so seen, and it helped me to work through some very strange cycles in my life and understanding relationships and who I was and purpose and just untangling the knots of what it means to be a human being. My mom later would start studying astrology also when we hit teen years. I have two sisters, we're very different, and she was just tearing at her hair like, who are these people? I can't understand them.
Who did I give birth to?
You know, right? So my mom, in her search for understanding and compassion towards us, she began the practice and literally fell down this like spiraling rabbit hole into esoteric astrology. And that correlated with a long period of time where I studied with a metaphysical teacher in Des Moines, Iowa, who focused on the Alice Bailey material and occult wisdoms and kind of bringing all of those different spaces together. So my mom was this really just dutiful student of esoteric astrology, and her copy of that book from Alice Bailey is just filled with Post-it notes and underlines and total Capricorn, Scorpio.
I love that.
Yeah. I've always let esoteric astrology inform the work that I do. But just as my mother put to me, she goes, most people are not there yet. Most of us are just, figuring life out, like just doing the real work. And if we take ourselves out of physical reality, then we're missing the opportunity to heal ourselves in real time rather than believing that there's some future self that we need to like build towards. Because if you're not accepting where you are now, how are you ever going to grow?
Yeah. Wow. So what was your first astrology book?
Well, I mentioned the secret language of birthdays, because that was one that Dorothy always had out, and it was fun to read, and there's pictures and you can compare yourself and you're like, oh, Teresa of St. Avila, like I'm same birthday as her, that type of thing. But the book, when I was ready to start practicing astrology, which I started to integrate into my Reiki and astrology practice, I used The Inner Sky. I always had copies of an ephemeris. I always had copies of Robert Hand's transit book. But my resistance towards learning astrology really came down to me saying, but Mom, I'm an energy worker. And she said, astrology is energy work. And this is what we do is really powerful energy work. And it is heady sometimes. So I think that bringing it into the body is the best thing that we can do as practitioners.
Mm.
So yeah, Forrest's work influenced a teacher that I had. And of course, my mom studied evolutionary astrology. And, Steven Forrest is kind of the guy. Like, I don't want to say he's the guy of the moment, but for a long time, he's made great strides in helping people to see astrology as a growth point rather than a fixed point. And he's so hammy, he just, he's like an old hippie telling these stories. So I really appreciated Inner Sky for breaking it down very simply. My mother always recommended to new astrologers astrology for dummies. I want to point out that when you are just learning the practice, don't think that you can jump up to evolutionary astrology with Merriman or up to these larger texts. You can't jump into Hellenistic astrology without the language to begin with. So having basic bitch books.
Yeah.
So like really simple things while you're learning the basics, like that's the start, I think. And then you grow from there.
Yeah. But I mean, don't you think third graders should be writing PhD theses?
I think that they should have astrology in school for third graders. I always thought my mom would end up doing that, like teaching about how we're different and, like that's why they work this way and you work this way.
I do think that is something that could be super amazing in culture, and that there's something about astrology that's resisting letting us do that with it. I know a number of astrologers who've written children's books, but for some reason it doesn't seep in. It's like there's a sort of cultural resistance to letting that be a valid cosmology for young people, unless they have private experiences like yours.
Well, that's true of looking for a university or something, like to study astrology and to receive a certification. Like even with Kepler or with Tony Howard's Astrology University, there's never like a governing body that allows for it to be a real certification. You'd have to go to the UK or Australia to receive something like that. So
yeah. Yeah. And the orgs are trying, the nonprofit orgs are shoring up that idea of professional certification on a different level, but it's not a university level. But yeah, so if we were going to stick you into a deserted island or fly you all the way around the world and not just into closer to the southern hemisphere, what 3 books would you have in your luggage?
that was such a good question because I am living out of a van. I mean, I have a
You're literally doing the thing already.
I'm doing the thing, and I had to make those decisions. And when I was going through Santa Fe, fortunately, I ran into Michael Bartlett and Jonah Emerson Bell and Lindsay, the Bad Pastor, and I got dropped some books into my lap along the way. A friend of mine in Gunnison gave me some Schulman copies. And I, of course, have Chiron and the Healing Journey from Melanie Reinhardt. So that was kind of top notch for me with bringing those books on hand. When I realized what Within Orb was about, I was like, oh my gosh, my library is 3,000 miles away. How am I ever going to come in tune with this? And I was like, these books are inside of you. Like, these books, and this is why you can do this.
Yeah.
I have to make a note that Within Orb is a really cute name. And all of my clients know I have a joke about like, I want a tight orb. It's got to be a tight orb or I'm not really interested in the aspect.
Yeah.
Oh, within orbit or within orb?
Yeah, no, it's within orb, as in that idea of the 2 planets can have that body space. I'm like extending my arms out. Like, are you in my body space? Are we within orb? Can we touch each other? And I chose that name ages ago, actually, all the way back in, I think when Jupiter was in Gemini the last time, because I was trying to name my business and I couldn't decide. I have every planet in Libra, and I was like, well, within orb is kind of like anything you want it to be. So that became just the name I've always had that name, and I registered the domain name ages ago. And then I was like, oh, I need to name my podcast. I'll just call it Within Orb, because it can be this now. Right now it's about books, but eventually it can grow into all kinds of conversations. So yeah, thank you.
It's good to know that you have everything in Libra. Thinking about your talk at NORWAC a few years ago on Mars and relationships. So that really resonates for me. And my Libra rising honors and admires the Libra in you.
And my Aries moon honors your Aries sun.
I feel so seen right now.
Yes. So let's get back to the books. I love what you said earlier about embodying astrology and the way Inner Sky got into you. And then also that here you are living out of a van and you have your library in your heart. It's 3,000 miles away. So it's like you still have this sort of reference inside of your, I don't know I don't want to just say only heart. It's a little bit more than that, but it's just like, you have it in you.
Right. And as an intuitive astrologer, that's sort of the way that I've always worked, is that if I'm regurgitating material from other authors, how is that unique, right? What does my voice have to offer to this? And when I started writing new moon and full moon reports in 2019, of course, I didn't think I could do it. And someone set me to the challenge and I was like, all right, let's do this, right? And I've written bi-monthly reports for over 5 years now. And I do that through the moon mailer. And of course, here I am, like going to grad school, writing the mailer twice a month. And when I look at the charts and when I'm feeling into the moment, I don't say, Venus is, square to Neptune at this moment. Because a lot of people don't speak that language.
Right.
When I'm with you, Jen, or when I'm with other astrologers, we can use technical language and we learn from each other. It's like,
but that's not the same as experiencing the magic of hearing it in English. Because if I really wanted you to help me, the last thing I would want to be doing is that's the sort of dangerous part of getting too far along is anytime someone does say something, I'm like, where did you get that from? What are you seeing that? Oh, I don't do the technique that way. Oh, no, your interpretation's all wrong. You can't say that about my chart. And it's like, wait a minute, we just went from a potentially healing conversation to like this analytical one-upmanship or some kind of, breakdown. And it's kind of sad when that happens. So I love that you have that ability to just go straight into the English and like forget the jargon and modulate that sort of, you know.
Right. And I love to teach from that perspective. And usually when I receive the information, I like feel it, and there'll be a gesture that comes out or a visual image, and like through storytelling. And astrology started off as storytelling. And then we got our grips on it. We, as in Western culture and the analytical mind and logic and proof and needing to science it, like, where is the poetry? Where is the beauty in that? Both are needed. I think that you have to have both hemispheres for it to make sense. But when we're trying to put the universe into a box, we're forgetting that it is vaster than we could ever comprehend. And that's true of our own bodies and of our own makeup. You, Jen, are we're both comprised of billions of organisms and microorganisms and little follicles and parts and all these things. And yet we think we're like one thing. We're like one solid mind, and that we're not changeable, and that we're not impressed upon by our relationships with everything.
Right. Yeah. The social construction of self as well. And I think astrology helps us realize that with the amount of tolerance you build when you're looking through the texts and understanding like, wow, this energy is not mine, but it is part of the whole picture.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine stepping into a room of 5,000 astrology books, turning a corner and stepping into a room of 2,000 more. The Celestial Arts Education Library is every astrologer's dream, and it can be yours. I invite you to come support Kaylee before you can visit physically. Your support will mean the creation of 52 new episodes of Within Orb next year, 4 issues of the Kaylee Review, our inaugural journal, and countless book talks, events, classes for our community. Visit our website, www.kaylee.institute/support, to select your level of care. Please help support Kaylee into the future, our future, so that we may study the future together. Thank you for listening. Please enjoy the rest of the show.
So I mentioned, okay, for the 3 pieces, the Chiron and the Healing Journey with Melanie Reinhardt was the one that I wanted to bring with. It is so well written. And I think that some of the older texts of Chiron I found oversimplified. I mean, as much as the Brabraham Cloud, like that was one of the seminal texts. And I remember returning to it a few years ago, and I was like, this doesn't feel complete. This feels like it was written a little too close to Chiron, you know, when it came around. And I think that there needed to be more time. And it's a great text. I have no beef with it. But I was like, I'm looking for something that feels really good. And Melanie Reinhardt is such a scholar and so deep, and really takes the mythology and the understanding of the individuation process of each person and the importance of the psychological awakening that we experience individually and collectively. So it takes a while to sort of chew through that book. It's like a rich dessert. So that's one I would definitely bring because I like taking my time with it.
Yeah. Yeah. This was also one of my first ones. It wasn't the first, but I have an emotional feeling when I see this copy. This is the white copy with the purple stripe on top, and it has a lovely image of a centaur, a kind of more graphic image there. It's been in my ambient space for so long. It's like belongs there. Like something's wrong if it's not there.
Oh, ambient space. Yeah, and that Chiron is a key shape. I think it's so important to include it as an asteroid in any reading because it does unlock something, right? And we're of a generation where so many of us are born with Chiron opposite Uranus. I don't know about you looking at these charts, like all of them have this connection, and you're like, okay, what is this about? What is this liberation about for all of us in working with the wound? So that's a favorite. Robert Hand's classic, Planets in Transit, Life Cycles for Living. This is one that has to be somewhere within reach, especially when I get blocked about interpreting a transit. You can always come back to a seminal text that rebirths itself again and again. And the wisdom that Hand brings to the language of astrology and understanding those life cycles, which are universal and individual, because not all of us are going to have a certain transit in a lifetime. But there are larger ones like the Saturn return, which we're all pretty familiar with. Like there's cycles that we experience with Uranus, with Saturn, and then of course the personal planets that kind of zoom by, but have crucial importance to our interpersonal development.
Yeah. I'm glad you've chosen to take this one with you. I feel like it's unsung hero. In a way, certain levels of getting into astrology mean you move past a cookbook And there's this kind of almost nasty thing that happens where people are just like, well, I don't do cookbook astrology. I do real astrology now. And it's like, yeah, but this is a classic. And honestly, if you're starting and you only have this book to read for the first 5 years of your work, you're going to be good. It's going to really be an anchor and teach you a lot if you read through it and work through it as the transits happen to your chart.
Precisely.
So I like the way you said it rebirths itself, and it's actually getting reborn as we speak. The revised edition is in utero somewhere in Rob Hand's mind. I keep hearing chatter that he's going to be coming out with another edition of it. So that might change the world given all of the traditional material that he's worked through in the meantime.
We're sending all the energy towards that because I want that born.
Yeah. And your third text?
Third text is Evolutionary Astrology, The Journey of the Soul Through the States of Consciousness by Raymond A. Merriman. This was a book that my mom used and introduced to me. I mean, I have a copy that looks like, some publisher print. I mean, it's very rudimentary, right? And I love that those texts that are hard to find, but so rich when you do get your hands on them. And what this book taught me about was the importance of the angles. And specifically the IC is what I reference from this book on the regular. We get caught up in just the planets, we're forgetting the orientation of the chart and the birth time. It's really, your big three and the rising is included. But what about your descendant?
Yeah.
What about your midheaven? What about the IC and how that plays into your levels of consciousness? I think of the Ememkweli, the IC, as this root system. It's like the base, or like where your trunk of your tree grounds into the earth, into the history of your own consciousness, and even your family lineage or ancestral lineage. If you're not someone who adheres to reincarnation, you can always look towards DNA. You can always look towards intergenerational trauma and blessings. I don't think we talk blessings enough with ancestral work, but for example, I have a Capricorn IC, not to talk about myself too much, but like I definitely was born a little old man. I was always very grumpy and like curmudgeon-y, and I had a lot of static rules about things. And I feel like through time I've gotten younger, as Capricorns do. But it taught me about like the patterns of betrayal and distrust and the control that helps to wag the dog in my chart makeup. And that wouldn't have been recognized if I hadn't looked at the IC and through the lens of Merriman's work. So evolutionary astrology in this specific text really integrates a lot of materials, and there's great charts, and it's broken down into little sections, and it's very delightful.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that idea of something that's wagging, like it's like a tail that's wagging the dog of your chart. I've never heard that kind of expression before. So that's how the IC would be, is like the rudder, I guess, or some kind of thing that's deeply shifting the movement or guiding you somehow.
Or stabilizing you, or it's the thing that you return back to. So we can look at the IC as who you are at home, like from a very basic level. You might think, oh, someone's a Leo and they act this way, but actually like they need to go home and organize everything in their kitchen, or they might have a very like stabilizing force, the way that they need to create solitude or to create a home life for themselves.
Yeah.
That strengthens the ability to step out into the world in the opposing sign, which typically is the case with MC and IC.
Yeah. The private part, the sort of more like comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
Hygge.
Into it.
Wow.
So those three. Yeah.
Let's talk about Alice Sparkly Cat. Let's bring post-colonial back up, because you began that and I was like, let's get back there. So let's go there now.
I love Alice Sparkly Cat's work, and I really appreciate the lens that they're bringing to the world. And post-colonial astrology is a text that you can feel the depth and the intention and the clarity and the detail that they spent putting this book together. And as someone who is working to decolonize my own spiritual practice and to decolonize some of those harsh boxes that get put around things, like that Western European thought system. In this text, there's a breakdown of power systems, how Greek mythology, how Western hierarchies really played into that work. And I think the part that really stuck out to me the most was early on in the book, she wrote about gold, right? And we think about gold and alchemy and, this work for personal transformation and the ability to self-actualize as a metaphor, but it's also about hoarding and about stealing and about who has more and who has less, the caste system, essentially. And that those who do have access to power and to money and to time are the ones who've had the opportunity to self-actualize. Science developed out of leisure, right? The observation, I'm going to stare at the sun until I go blind, and then I'm going to write about it or tell somebody about it because I can't see to write. But essentially, like, we were out of survival mode, and there was people wealthy enough that they could sit and observe the universe in a different way that was out of the survival necessity.
Right. And the way they talk about like decolonizing the planets and that exercise is so amazing to see too. I feel like it's a difficult book for people to read if they're not already engaged in that kind of work because it's so confrontational.
Right. And that's exactly what needs to happen is, hello, Pluto, return for the United States, and it's going to go back and kick itself again this election era. I know this is an evergreen podcast, but I just keep thinking about we're going through it, and this is the time that we review and unearth and dig in and find the gross stuff as much as we can find the jewels. Like, we're in a compost heap period, and it's very stinky.
Yeah.
Very, very stinky right now.
Yeah, I think it's a great book to have exposure to. And if it is difficult, just keep it around, let it simmer. I do believe that books get into you through osmosis. So, there's something to be said for just having it in your sphere within orb, one might say. But I'm glad that you picked that one too, as an addition to everything here, because it adds a dimensionality to working with the planets and what they are, and also what we put on them that may not be theirs.
Yeah, that projection, because that is a piece of it that historically, the moon and menstrual cycles, and, we're projecting these concepts of femininity onto the moon, and eventually you have a quantum experience where it's like, the moon does mean that now.
Yeah. Do you want to know a fun fact about the moon?
Tell me more.
So there is, I don't know if it's still located there, but in the town next door to Cayley, there was a lab that was called Off-Planet Research. And they studied lunar particles that they manufactured out of the regolith at Antarctica. So the material that the moon is made of is on our planet too, because at one point the moon came from part of Earth. And lunar molecules are shaped like what they called at the lab. They call them this angry Cheerios. They are like a razor blade in the shape of a Cheerio that's ionized positive and negative, meaning if you ionize whatever like wheel thing you have up on the moon, it will only take away half the particles. And if you flip it to negative from positive, it'll let the other half come and stay. So basically, if you put anything rubber wheel on the moon, it'll be destroyed within 2 hours. So people are having these wonderful, beautiful, flowy, voluptuous impressions of the watery, nurturing moon. And I'm like, it is hostile, like molecularly, absolutely hostile, And I just love that the science just like punches you in the face with that fact of just, angry Cheerios. Like that doesn't fill your belly. That literally rips you apart.
Oh, I am all for that. Interesting anecdote, like the astrology of the moon and what you said about the razor blades and such, that in esoteric astrology, we look at it as a dead rock. That's what Alice Bailey's work calls it, is it's a dead rock. And so it embodies the karmic patterns that have solidified. So often we can look towards the moon to see where those deep patterns and behaviors are that you're here to work on. It's not just about like your childhood or your nurturing or who you look to for your creative juices, right? It's about like what has solidified that you need to digest.
Wow.
Razor blade Cheerios.
Right. Well, I've been rewatching House, and he hobbles around on his cane because he's got necrosis in his thigh. And in Tibetan Buddhism, the thigh is a very vital part of the body. The thigh bone lives on after we die. And so you're saying this moon, the dead rockness of just that part of, if I think about corporeally, like there's something in us that's just kind of like atrophied or necrotic.
Great word.
So much for that lunar, my emotional body. It's like, no, that's your tumor. That's your dead zone. Sorry. I mean, it's multivalent. You can look at it this way and that way and the other way, but I appreciate that. There's not been many people on the show who've talked about esoteric astrology and definitely not shared that facet of the way the moon is seen. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I feel like when I've gotten to go to conferences, or specifically this trip down to Baja when I got to meet Michael Bartlett, I hadn't met another esoteric astrologer in a long time besides my mom. And being able to sit in a conversation and talk about the seven rays and the inner hierarchical rulers of planets, and like it's its own thing. And I was like, wow, I like kept up with this like hotshot astrologer, like in these conversations. But that's why we love doing this, is we get to celebrate each other, and that stuff that I don't know, and then I know stuff that maybe you don't know, and then we can like synchronize.
Well, also there's also in lineage, it seems like with certain trends that dominate the public discourse, it feels like there's a bit of I got to be in the closet about humanistic astrology or about esoteric astrology or about psychological astrology at this point, or in certain circles, right? And it's like, but there's gifts in all of them when you look at them for what they are. I might not want to practice or even study esoteric astrology, but that visualization of the moon is giving me something really awesome to think about, and that cross-pollination.
Yes. And you can take bits and pieces from all of them. I know that there are a lot of purists out there. I know that there's with Demetra George's work coming out, and like all of this great material that she's bringing from classical traditional astrology. I can't live without the outer planets. And that to me, it's like, sorry guys, like I appreciate all your magic and all this good stuff, but like without Uranus, doesn't mean shit.
Yeah, but she's great at contradicting herself, because now she's in a hyper-modern asteroid mood again, which I love. So she's sort of, she's kind of like, yeah, I did that, and now I'm ready to just totally punk out on the asteroids nonstop. And so I think it's cool when we can think of ourselves as kind of traveling over here in astrology land and then going in this direction, and they all have something to say.
Indeed. Indeed.
Yeah. So if you were going to help someone get into the field at this point, what books would you put in their hands? Or maybe not books. Maybe you would make them do something else.
Let's see. The Astrology University is a great school, and it kind of teaches like the base language and breaks things down. I was like, you guys do whole sign houses, and that's not my style, and kind of like drifted away because I need accountability when it comes to classwork. But I really enjoy the depth of it, like all of the different teachers they're bringing to that space. So if you're not a book reader and you need somebody to hold your hand a bit more, and I mean that so lovingly, like Tony Howard is a great dude, and like he is so enthusiastic, and he's constantly putting material out there and free stuff online and all that type of thing. So really appreciate the work he's offering out there. I mentioned The Inner Sky for myself as one of the earlier texts that I read. I think it's a great, easy to digest break down what's a sign, what's a planet, what's the horizon, what's a descendant, like just keeping it very simple. Because if you're going to learn a language, you have to get the vocabulary down to begin with. And I think that taking it from an evolutionary standpoint makes it less black and white, right? He's actually looking at the universe and the sky, not just from a Greek mythological perspective. Another basic text, Robert Hand's horoscope symbols. I mean, I disagree with him on a lot of stuff, but I think that book is really well written and very in-depth. And he has kind of an authority about him that I like a little bit.
Yeah.
He's like, this is the way it is. And you're like, well, okay, but think about it more. But it's a really good kind of keeping it simple text.
Mm-hmm.
If you want a little bit of like mundane, mystical, esoteric work, there's a text called Astrology Illumined. The subtitle is Revealing Soul Through Astrology. That's written by Donna Mitchell-Moniak and Sarah Traub. I'm sorry if I mispronounced Donna's last name there. This one can be hard to find. I remember when it like went out of print and I was like, crap, how can I recommend this book? But it's a little basic in the best way, but it also breaks down higher themes and what they call turns of the spiral. That would be looking at the seasons of astrology, let's say for Libra and for the planet Venus associated with it. Are we just looking at money and stuff and manipulation and diplomacy? Or are we looking at values and our ethics and what is right relationship with everything? How can you relate not just with humans, but with the planet and with water and with food and with animals and your clothing? And you're just starting to see it from this different lens where it's not just like, oh, they're indecisive. It's like, wow, relationships are complex and there's a bigger view that we need to engage with. And you'd be interested in this, that Uranus is the esoteric ruler of Libra. And as a Libra rising, I really jam with that because
Yeah.
you can be a Mars Aries or you can be a Mercury Aries, and you can evolve or move between those two spaces depending on how you navigate your consciousness. If astrology teaches us nothing, it's about development of consciousness.
Yeah, I love that for Libras because whenever I think of Uranus, I think of that gif of the panda flipping the work table. Have you ever seen this one? Like it's like an angry panda who's like tromping around this. It's someone in a panda outfit. Honestly, it's not an actual animal, but then he just takes someone's desk and he just flips it over, and I'm like, that's Uranus. That's Uranus right there, just disrupting things. Things are supposed to be normal, and here's this force that just comes in and just like, bam, here we go. Another tidbit from Esoteric. So I'm picking up on, actually, there might be more to Esoteric than we know. And if we suspend our need for this old is best, there could be some really fruitful morsels in that field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you have to feel it for yourself, and for me, I take what feels right and I try to digest that stuff because esoteric astrology sounds very inaccessible because it gets into these like the fixed and cardinal wheels of consciousness and like your future lives. And that's not helpful right now. Like, I want to know what's going on in your relationship right now in your life. Like, we're not talking about 3 lifetimes from now. That's not helpful.
What about 3 lifetimes ago?
Well, that's where evolutionary astrology and nodes and Pluto and
But is that also equally helpful if we're thinking of it the now?
It really depends on the individual you're working with and what kind of metaphors that they appreciate. I always try to keep it, like open, right? I'm someone who provides past life regressions for people, and in my disclaimer, it's like, this can be a story because we work with stories. And that's how our metaphors like sink into our bodies, like yang and symbols and archetypes, all of that sink into our consciousness in a way that's much easier to wrap our heads around than numbers and broken down figures and data. So sometimes a story can help us to heal and feel for us. And whether it's real or not, if it helped you, or if it's a metaphor for something currently happening or a pattern, it can be helpful.
Wow. Speaking of being helpful, how can people find you?
I am available. I see people from all over the world. I have clients on a lot of continents right now, but you can find me at ursidae.us. That's a Latin word for bear. It's spelled Rsidae. I'm sure you'll put in the show notes.
Yes.
And I provide a bi-monthly report I call the Moon Mailer. And I do an Inspired Astrology podcast that's one to 2 times a month. Often Jonah Emerson Bell joins me for that. So I provide readings at distance. I teach when I'm in person, and I'm going to be driving through your region. So hopefully I can come and meet up with you in human again and talk more about all the things about moon and Cheerios and all that.
The moon and Cheerios, and check out the books here and see if there's long lost esoteric friends hiding out.
Makes my heart flutter.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be here and share everything with us.
It's an absolute pleasure. I just think you're so cool, and I love that I got to be on your show. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Within Orb. To learn more about the Celestial Arts Education Library, or to become a member, visit our website at caeli.institute. That's www.caeli.institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please help spread the word. Follow or subscribe to Within Orb in your podcatcher of choice. Rate it 5 stars or write us a happy review. This helps others find the show. We also want to give a big thanks to the indie band The E-Block for contributing their song Wake Up for our intro and outro music. You can find them at their website, eblockband.com. This is Jenn Zahrt, signing off for now. See you next time.